He looked like just another old man, quiet, weathered, holding a faded military ID no one had seen in decades. The young officer at the gate laughed him off, dismissing him as a nobody from the past. But minutes later, a call from the Pentagon froze the entire checkpoint because the man they had just turned away wasn't forgotten. He was protected. His name, buried deep in classified history, was never meant to be spoken. Until now, this is the story they almost never got the chance to hear. In the quiet stillness of a desert morning, the town of Wickenburg, Arizona, stirred slowly to life. Birds chirped against the pale sky, and the wind whispered dry secrets through the mesquite trees. On the edge of this modest community, in a small, one-story adobe house whose paint had long since faded to memory, an old man, dressed with deliberate care, Arthur Shaw, just past 80, moved with the calculated precision of a man who had spent his life mastering control. Every gesture, buttoning his shirt, smoothing the creases in his khaki trousers, polishing the scuffed but clean shoes, was methodical, almost ritualistic. He wasn't in a hurry. He hadn't been in a hurry for decades. Time had taught him that haste rarely changed an outcome. It just revealed the lack of preparation. The house bore no signs of vanity. No awards hung on the walls, no photographs sat framed on dusty shelves. Just a simple crucifix, a single folded flag in a wooden case, and a narrow desk near the window. On that desk lay two objects: a military ID card, yellowed, frayed at the corners, the plastic beginning to crack, and a thick envelope sealed with aged government tape. Shaw picked up the ID, holding it in his hand like a relic. The picture on it barely resembled the man he was now. Broad-shouldered, sharp-jawed, eyes full of cold intensity. But those eyes had changed. They were softer now. Not weaker, just quieter. Beneath them, the burden of memory had carved lines time alone could never draw. He pocketed the card, then the envelope, the one he had resealed each year on this day, always addressed but never delivered. He stepped outside, greeted by the dry November air. The sun was still climbing, casting long golden shadows across the hard-packed ground. Today was Veterans Day, a day of parades, speeches, and ceremonial thanks. Shaw had avoided it every year for 4 decades, but this morning felt different. There was no single reason why. Maybe it was the weight of silence accumulated over the years, or maybe, simply, he was ready to face the names etched in granite and memory. He drove his old truck, a faded Ford from the 80S that still ran with the stubborn will of its owner, for nearly 40 minutes across desert highways, the kind that seemed to stretch forever into nothingness. He said little to himself, only nodded once as Fort Walker came into view, an aging army installation built into the wide openness of Arizona's basin. At the gate, he stopped, took a breath, and looked down at the ID again. A faint smile tugged at his mouth, not amusement, but resignation. The world had changed. Protocols had changed. Faces had changed. But names? Names didn't. The ones on that wall? They stayed the same. He stepped out, spine straight, steps measured and unhurried. Dressed in a crisp blue button-up and his old brown field jacket, the one that had traveled across jungles, deserts, and perhaps too many dreams. Shaw looked neither frail nor proud, just present, completely and without apology. In his right hand, he carried the old ID. On the left is the envelope. As he approached the gate, the sun glinted off the metallic letters mounted above it. Fort Walker. Honor, duty, remembrance. A fitting motto, perhaps, but some honors, Shaw knew, were not displayed in stone or steel. They were written in scars, in silence, and in the promises a man keeps when no one else remembers they were made. Today he had come not for himself, but for them, the forgotten, the fallen, and for a debt he had never stopped paying. The morning sun had fully risen when Arthur Shaw reached the main entrance of Fort Walker. The desert air was crisp but carried a warmth that hinted at the coming afternoon heat. A few guards stood stationed at the gate. Standard protocol. What was not standard was the man approaching them with the grace of a soldier and the silence of someone who had long ago made peace with being overlooked. "Good morning," Shaw said softly, offering his card. His voice was measured and respectful, not frail. It held no demand, no presumption, only the kind of quiet certainty that made some men stand straighter without knowing why. Lieutenant Adam Miller, just 26, took the card with practiced indifference. Newly posted and ambitious, Miller had volunteered for base security to prove himself, but quickly learned it was mostly routine. Checking IDs, logging visitors, preventing trouble that never really arrived. Until now. He squinted at the ID, the edges curled like parchment, the lettering faded, and the photo ancient. "This expired in 1994, Miller said, chuckling as he turned it over in his hand. Behind him, Sergeant Lopez wandered over, coffee in hand. Broad-shouldered, loud, and comfortable with authority, Lopez leaned in to look. "You serious?" He laughed. "You think this is still valid, old-timer?" "You've got to be kidding." Shaw stood motionless. He did not correct them. He did not flinch. "Come on, sir," Miller added, a condescending smile pulling at his lips. "To enter a military installation, you need a valid ID, a real one. You need to be an active soldier, not someone clinging to an old piece of plastic." A few other guards nearby turned to watch. Some smirked. Others simply looked away. No one stepped forward. Shaw gave a small nod. He reached to take his ID back, calm and dignified, his face unreadable. No anger, no embarrassment. Only the heavy patience of someone who had stood before far worse men and survived without losing himself. He turned to leave, pocketing both the ID and the envelope, his steps slow but steady. There was no protest, no confrontation, just a quiet exit, the kind that left a strange chill in the air. Inside the checkpoint booth, Private Rick Hernandez had watched the exchange silently. Unlike the others, he hadn't laughed. Something about the old man's composure didn't sit right. Rick had only been stationed at Fort Walker for 6 months, fresh out of basic training, and still adjusting to military life. But as the son of a career serviceman, he'd grown up hearing stories about the old school warriors, the ones who never talked much but whose actions echoed through generations. That man, Chop, reminded him of those stories. Later, when the others had returned to their posts, still chuckling about Grandpa with the antique ID, Rick ducked into the back room and pulled out his phone. He hesitated only a second before tapping a name. Uncle Jim, a personnel officer at the Pentagon. "Uncle Jim, it's Rick. I'm okay, just had something weird happen. An elderly guy tried to get on base, probably in his 80s. Had a military ID from the 90s as the guys laughed him off, but..." Rick paused, looking through the window at the bench outside the gate. Shaw had stopped there, just sitting, calm as ever, envelope still clutched in his hand. Didn't argue, didn't act unstable or confused, just different, composed, like he didn't need anyone's approval. "Could you maybe check a name for me?" "Arthur Shaw, probably commissioned in the 70s or even earlier." Rick ended the call and sat down, eyes still on the figure outside. He whispered to himself, repeating something his father once told him. When everyone turns their back, only conscience remains. And in that moment, Rick knew something about today was about to change. Inside the cafeteria at Fort Walker, the morning buzz was beginning to settle. Soldiers came and went in uniformed clusters, trays clattering, boots echoing off the tiled floor. Helen Martinez, who had served food on this base for over 3 decades, moved like a quiet force of nature behind the counter, observant, unobtrusive, and vastly underestimated. As a group of guards passed by, laughing about some incident at the gate, she caught fragments of their conversation. "Nation ID," one of them said, chuckling. "Dude looked like he walked out of a history book. Jacket probably older than I am. Thought he could just stroll in with that thing, added another. Didn't even argue when we sent him packing. Helen paused, wiping her hands on her apron. What did he look like? She asked, her voice steady. The guards looked at each other, then shrugged. Old guy, maybe 80, skinny, crazy straight posture, quiet, had a brown jacket, didn't say much. Helen froze, her breath catching for a moment. Her eyes narrowed, was calm, didn't raise his voice, just took it and walked away. The guards nodded, now intrigued. Helen slowly put down the tray she was carrying. I've seen him before, she said quietly. Just once, back in '89. There was a fire in the weapons depot. 3 men trapped inside, smoke thick as oil. Everyone else hesitated. That man, he walked in. No gear, no backup. Just went in and dragged them out. One by one, the laughter around the table stopped. I never caught his name, Helen continued, her voice softer now. But I never forgot his face. And one of the younger guards scoffed. If that's true, he'd be some kind of hero. Helen looked at him evenly. Not all heroes want to be remembered. The story spread like wildfire. Within the hour, someone had snapped a photo of Shaw sitting silently on the bench outside the gate and posted it on the base's internal comms channel. The caption read, "Anyone know this veteran? Turned away at gate. Helen says he saved lives in '89. Responses began to roll in. That looks like the guy in the picture on Colonel Reynolds' wall. My dad served in the 70 said as Shaw-led extractions in Cambodia. Didn't Arthur Shaw get a posthumous commendation? I thought he died. Inside the logistics office, Rick Hernandez sat by the phone, nerves winding tight. 20 minutes after his call to the Pentagon, it rang. He grabbed it instantly. This is Private Hernandez. The voice on the other end was clipped, authoritative. Private Hernandez, this is Colonel James Wexler from the Pentagon, Special Operations Historical Division. I need to speak with the commanding officer of your checkpoint. Immediately. Put me on speaker. Rick's heart pounded. Yes, sir. He rushed out of the office. Lieutenant Miller, sir, call from the Pentagon. They're asking for you. Miller, still chuckling about the morning incident with Lopez, froze. For Pentagon? Yes, sir, they sound. Serious? Miller entered the room, straightening his uniform. This is Lieutenant Miller. The line cracked for half a second, then Wexler's voice boomed through the speaker. Lieutenant, this is Colonel James Wexler. You are being recorded. This call is now a matter of internal military protocol. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Miller said, his voice faltering. The man you turned away at your checkpoint is Colonel Arthur E. Shaw, former commander of Special Forces Bravo Team, active from 1971 to 1979. His security clearance remains in effect under General Order 1017A. He is not only permitted entry, he is to be treated with full honors. The room fell deathly silent. Miller's face drained of color. Lopez stood motionless. Sir, no. Wexler didn't wait. Colonel Shaw led the most successful extraction unit of the Vietnam War. He commanded the Cambodia POW rescue mission in '75. 28 Americans were brought home. 0 casualties. That operation is still partially classified. A low gasp rose from the room. Wexler's tone sharpened. A vehicle is en route. Extend every courtesy to Colonel Shaw until it arrives. As if summoned by fate, a sleek black military SUV turned onto the access road. It rolled to a stop at the gate, and 3 high-ranking officers emerged, 2 lieutenant colonels and 1 full-bird colonel, with rows of combat ribbons gleaming on his chest. I'm Colonel Harris, the man said without preamble. Where is Colonel Shaw? Miller pointed in stunned silence to the bench. Harris gave a curt nod and strode forward, followed by the others. Rick pressed his face to the glass as they approached Shaw. Harris came to a halt and offered a crisp salute. Shaw rose slowly, returning it with a calm gravity that seemed to stop time. No words could be heard, but the gestures said everything. Hands shaken, heads bowed. The envelope passed with reverence from Shaw to Harris. 15 minutes later, the group returned. Lieutenant Miller and Sergeant Lopez now stood at full attention, backs rigid. "These gentlemen," Colonel Harris announced, "will be entering the base under my authorization." As they passed through the checkpoint, Harris paused and turned to the guards. "For your information," he said coldly, "that expired ID card contains an embedded transmitter. Colonel Shaw activates it once a year on Veterans Day to signal that he's still alive. We monitor that frequency." Miller swallowed hard. "Sir, I had no idea." "No," Harris replied. "You didn't. You saw an old man with a weathered ID and made a decision based on nothing but what your eyes could see. That man has read files you'll never be cleared to touch. He's saved more American lives than everyone at this checkpoint combined." Behind them, the wind stirred. Somewhere far across the base, the honor guard was being assembled. And the story of Colonel Arthur Shaw, the legend no one remembered until it was almost too late, had just begun to rise again. The base was no longer quiet. As word of Colonel Arthur E. Shaw's presence spread, Fort Walker shifted from routine operations to something close to sacred ceremony. The name, once forgotten by many, unknown to most, now moved through the ranks like a whisper of legend coming back to life. Within an hour, the base commander had been briefed, the flag detail was recalled, dress uniforms were ordered. By noon, Fort Walker had transformed itself into an unplanned but urgent tribute. But none of that reached Shaw. He sat quietly in a small room off the administration building, his old brown jacket folded neatly beside him, sipping water, eyes distant. He hadn't asked for recognition. He had come only to leave the envelope at the memorial as he had always intended. Now, the ripple of a morning misunderstanding had turned into a tidal wave of remembrance. Colonel Harris returned and gently placed the envelope on the table before Shaw. "We've reviewed the contents," he said quietly. "Letters, all of them addressed to the families of the men who didn't make it back under your command." "You've written them every year?" Shaw gave a slight nod. "Every Veterans Day. One letter for each man. I didn't think they were ever read." Harris paused. "They were—" Shaw looked up, brows slightly furrowed. "Each time your transmitter activated," Harris explained, "we sent someone to check in. Quietly. Your handwriting, your return address. Someone made sure they got where they were meant to go." Shaw's throat tightened, but he said nothing. Meanwhile, the internal comms system was buzzing. Photos of Shaw were now circulating with messages like, "It's the Cambodia rescue mission. It was real, and he led it. My father said he served under Shaw in 73. Said he never met a better man. This is the one who never left anyone behind." Private Hernandez sat alone near the security post, staring at his phone, barely able to process it all. His uncle had called back, this time with more urgency than before. "Rick," the voice said, tense, "you don't understand. Shaw didn't just lead missions. He ran the most classified extraction unit in U.S. history. Whole ops that are still redacted. The kind of work that doesn't get medals, because the people saved aren't even supposed to exist." "But why didn't he speak up?" Rick had asked. There was a long pause, then came the reply, "Because men like Shaw don't need to prove anything. They know who they are. The mission was always bigger than the man." At 1:00 p.m., Shaw was invited, formally, to speak to the base's young service members. The auditorium filled quickly, with over 200 recruits packed into rows. Many had never heard his name that morning. Now they waited in solemn silence, eyes trained on the stage where legends were born. General Carrington, Fort Walker's commanding officer, took the podium first. "Today," he began, "we are honored beyond measure. With us is Colonel Arthur Shaw, retired, former commander of Special Forces Bravo. Many of his operations remain classified, but I assure you, the impact of his actions is still felt in the lives saved and in the silence he kept. We stepped back. The room held its breath as Shaw made his way up the stairs. No uniform, no medals, just the same pressed shirt and time-worn jacket. But his presence filled the room like a tide slowly rising. He stood at the podium for a moment without speaking. Then, softly, "I didn't come here to talk." The room leaned in. "I came to pay respects to those who didn't make it home, the men whose names are on that wall outside. This visit wasn't meant for attention, but since you've asked me to speak to your recruits, I'll say this." He paused again, his voice gathering strength. "Honor isn't a medal, or a card, or even a rank. It's the choice you make when no one's watching. It's what you do when the mission's over and the only eyes on you are your own." Murmurs stilled. Breathing seemed to stop. "I never talked much about my service," he went on. "Not because of secrecy, because what mattered wasn't who did the work. What mattered was that it got done. The men I served with didn't need headlines or parades. We had each other. We had the job. And when that was done, we lived with the rest, quietly." He turned his gaze toward the back of the room and found Lieutenant Miller. This young officer did what he believed was right. He followed the rules. But I would ask each of you to remember sometimes what matters most isn't written in a manual. Sometimes you must see beyond the credentials, beyond the surface. Miller stood frozen, the weight of those words pressed on him like a physical force. Later that afternoon, Miller approached Shaw again, this time at the memorial wall. The old man stood still, fingers tracing names etched in stone, names he had carried for 40 years. "Colonel Shaw," Miller began, voice barely a whisper, "I owe you an apology. For this morning, I was dismissive and judgmental." It turned slowly. "You were doing your job, Lieutenant." "No, sir, I was following procedure. But my job is more than that. It's protecting this place with respect, with judgment, and I failed." Shaw studied him quietly. Then, finally, he spoke. "It's not your fault. It's how you were trained to see people." Miller blinked, confused. "In my time," Shaw continued, "we were taught to evaluate the man, not just his papers. That part seems to have been forgotten." That simple truth hit harder than any reprimand. Nearby, Sergeant Lopez lingered, his face tight with thought. He finally stepped forward. "Sir, my father served at Camrambe in 72. Said a colonel named Shaw saved his unit during a night extraction. That was you, wasn't it?" Shaw didn't speak at first, just looked at him. "What was your father's name, son?" "Carlos Lopez served 5th Infantry." A faint smile touched Shaw's lips. "I remember. He helped carry 2 wounded men to the pickup point. Didn't stop, even when the fire got close." Lopez blinked. "He never told me that part." "The brave ones rarely do," Shaw replied gently. As the sun began its descent over Fort Walker, an honor guard stood assembled near the memorial. The base commander, joined by his officers, saluted Shaw in full dress. No music played, no fanfare sounded, just solemn reverence. At the main gate, Lieutenant Miller stood at rigid attention as Shaw's vehicle approached. He rendered a perfect salute. Shaw, seated in the back seat of the black SUV, returned it slow, precise, absolute. In that silent moment, there was no rank, no mistake, no reprimand. Only the unspoken understanding between 2 soldiers from different generations that honor, once earned, cannot be dimmed by time or circumstance. The sun was beginning its slow descent beyond the horizon when Lieutenant Miller returned to his post. His uniform, once crisp with arrogance, now felt heavier with awareness. The events of the day played on a loop in his mind. Every word he had spoken, every glance he had cast, every assumption he had made. And every one of them had been wrong. He stood by the checkpoint where just hours earlier he had turned away a living legend. This time, he stood not as a gatekeeper, but as a quiet witness to something far greater than himself. Beside him, Sergeant Lopez was uncharacteristically silent. The man who once cracked jokes about old IDs now stared into the distance, jaw tight, hands folded. They both turned as Private Rick Hernandez approached, a folded piece of paper in his hand. "Miller," he said quietly, "I've drafted something." Miller took the paper and read. It was a short inscription, nothing fancy, just a few lines of humility carved from shame and respect. Gate, in honor of quiet valor. On this ground, assumptions failed. Honor did not. Later that evening, with approval from their commanding officer, a small bronze plaque was commissioned and mounted to the checkpoint post. No speeches were given, no photographers were invited, only a handful of guards stood silently as the final bolts were tightened into the concrete. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The message was for the future, not the past. Meanwhile, at the edge of the base, Colonel Shaw stood once more at the memorial wall. The stone slabs were now bathed in the soft gold of dusk. His fingers moved gently across the engraved names, some long familiar, others faded by time. It was not grief on his face. It was something deeper, older. The kind of ache that lives in the bones, not the heart. Senior intelligence officer approached him quietly, holding a sealed folder. "Colonel," he said softly, "there's something you should know." Shaw turned, curious. "All those letters you wrote, they were never lost. We made sure they reached the families." Shaw blinked, genuinely taken aback. "But I never mailed them." "No, sir, but the envelopes had addressed, and once your signal was logged each year, we'd send someone to check in. They'd find the letters. We deliver them, every single one." For the first time that day, Arthur Shaw showed emotion. His shoulders lowered slightly, his eyes dampened but did not spill. "The Sullivan family?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yes, sir. In Oregon, and the Williamses. Georgia, all of them, every year." He turned away, blinking hard, hand pressing against one of the names. For 4 decades he had written into silence, never knowing those words of remembrance had arrived, never knowing the families had kept every one of them. And now, standing before the wall, he knew the dead were not forgotten, not by him, not by those they left behind. Elsewhere on the base, word of Shaw's story had begun to ripple out beyond ranks and roles. In the barracks, soldiers gathered in small clusters, some reading the bulletin posts aloud. My uncle served with Shaw in Laos, said he was the only CO who ate last, slept least, and stayed calm under fire. I thought men like that were myths. Turns out they just stopped talking. That old man wrote letters every year for 40 years. That's what honor looks like. That night, under a sky full of stars, Private Hernandez stood alone at Shaw Gate. He had no words left, just the weight of having done one thing right in a sea of indifference. He didn't know it yet, but the next day, a transfer order would appear on his desk, an offer to attend officer candidate school, backed by a personal recommendation from Colonel Wexler. In the months that followed, recruits began using Shaw Standard as quiet slang, a way to call each other to a higher sense of duty, and the checkpoint, once just a place to flash a badge, became a place where soldiers stood straighter, looked longer, and thought twice. Because sometimes the lesson isn't in the command, it's in the correction. Months passed. Life at Fort Walker returned to its regular rhythm. Formations, drills, deployments, and the daily noise of a living base. But something had changed, subtly but profoundly. It wasn't in the manuals or the official memos. but in the quiet decisions made by its soldiers. They started checking ID cards with a little more care and a little more respect. They asked one more question, waited one more second, and every time a new recruit was posted to the front gate, someone pointed toward the bronze plaque now mounted on the concrete pillar, Gate in honor of quiet valor. The story never made the news. There were no headlines, no viral articles. At Shaw's request, everything remained within military circles. Even the footage from the gate camera showing the moment he was turned away and later saluted by full colonels was quietly archived under training and leadership case study. But still, the story grew. It was passed in whispers between platoon leaders and young corporals. It showed up in officer school simulations, presented as a scenario. You encounter an elderly man with outdated credentials. What do you do? Most cadets gave textbook answers. Then the instructor would reveal the truth. That man commanded operations you still don't have clearance to read. And always the lesson, see the person, not just the paperwork. Back in Wickenburg, Arthur Shaw resumed his quiet life. He continued writing letters every Veterans Day, not because he had to, but because he always had. Only now he wrote them knowing someone was listening. Every November 11th, a black SUV from Fort Walker would appear outside his home. The soldier assigned would always knock once, salute, and wait while Shaw handed over the new stack of letters. Nothing was said, nothing needed to be. In time, Private Rick Hernandez graduated from Officer Candidate School with distinction. During his final speech, he didn't quote regulations or military greats. He simply said, "Never judge a warrior by the date on a plastic card. Judge them by the weight of what they carry and how quietly they carry it." As for Lieutenant Miller, now Captain Miller, he would often retell the story of Shaw Gate to new officers under his command, not to shame himself, but to remind them of something deeper. Some badges, he would say, aren't worn on a chest. They're engraved into a man's silence. Years later, Arthur Shaw passed away at the age of 89, alone in his home. He left no will, no last request, no list of accomplishments. But on his desk, they found a single sealed envelope addressed not to a family, but to anyone who might find it. Inside was a handwritten letter. Honor does not fade. It only needs one person to remember it. Justice may be delayed, but it is never absent. Don't give up, not when you know you're right. The letter was placed in Fort Walker's historical archive. Beside his ID, now preserved behind glass, a simple placard read, "An expired ID, but honor that never will." On the next Veterans Day, a new plaque was quietly installed beneath the original bronze marker at Shaw Gate. It bore the last words Colonel Shaw had spoken to the base commander before leaving for the final time. "I came only to visit those I couldn't save." At sunset, a single soldier stood alone at the gate, saluting the empty road beyond. Because some men leave behind no monuments, mi standard